great collaboration involves a lot of trust and a lot of communication and a lot of really looking and trial and error. Rather than be stuck in the realm of the ideas, you've got to be able to look at the thing in front of you and go, is it successful, isn't it successful?
How that plays out visually could be any number of things, but with artists that have such recognizable styles like Damien Hirst, Space Invader, and me, I think it's inevitable that all of our voices are going to be seen in the end result.
There's many ways to collaborate and many ideas, but the art's got to grab hold of you first. Yeah, I mean, I think collaborations are tricky things, but Space Invader and Shepard are really great guys. So I was toying around with some ideas of group shows, and then I asked both Shepard and Space if they wanted to do a collaboration. The greatest thing about the collaborations is that there's a kind of shared sensibility, really, with, I think, other people's work. So I think it's like, I think you have to have an ability and a kind of empathy to be able to understand other artists' work in order to be able to collaborate well. I think, at first glance, you might think that the three of our work are coming from very different places. So then to sort of have empathy, sympathy, and understanding, but also retain the power of what each of us are trying to do is not an easy thing. And I think you have to sort of bring instinct into it a lot more clearly.
Getting the opportunity to collaborate with Space Invader and Damien Hirst is really amazing for me because I'm a huge fan of both of their work over the years, where they're coming from being renegades who always rise to the challenge of making something that's not necessarily easy to convert into successful art. They make that happen by determination and innovation.
I think a lot of the work in Triple Trouble was a lot more successful than I would have ever expected, especially working with three people. I mean, it's a lot easier to collaborate with two, I would imagine, although always, of course, it depends on the people. But I think the fact that there were three of us and we managed to pull off so many works and in so many different directions and so many ideas, and quite quickly, I think is a real testament to the personalities of the other two guys. I really enjoyed working with them. I really enjoyed working on the show, and I really enjoyed working on all the pieces. There was a piece that we made, which is really the first piece you see when you go in the show, a kind of image of a third eye that I'd made, surrounded by my butterfly mandalas. And I think what happened was either Shepard sent me some kind of mock-up with one of my mandalas on it, and then I changed it a little bit, or I sent him a mandala to paint on top of. But in the end, we kind of messed around with it a little bit more and changed the colours. And we were going to make two, and I thought we were going to choose one for the show, but Shepard really wanted to hang both side by side and show the differences, even though they're very similar. One's kind of white and one's kind of blue. But they work really, really well. And for Shepard, I ended up doing printed butterflies on paper and painting around them instead of doing real butterflies, because it didn't really feel right to be doing real butterflies with Shepard.
These are two of my favorite pieces in the show. I think that they're a very, very successful fusion of Damien's style and my style. They were a concept that I was very excited to present to Damien at the very beginning of the process of making all the work in this show. Damien's butterfly mandalas are incredible. They're beautiful from a distance, they're beautiful up close. The surface quality is really extraordinary. But I liked the idea of melding those with an imagery of mine that was more graphic. So there could be the subtlety along with the boldness. I chose this woman who originally I created for a poster of mine that's become pretty widely known, called Make Art Not War, because I felt that she worked very, very nicely in this circular holding shape, and then blending this eye with where the hemispheres meet between the mandala and that. I call the piece the Third Eye Butterfly Mandala, based on the idea that the third eye is our spiritual eye that opens us up to things that are more peaceful and harmonious. I think that these works are a really, really ideal blend of what Damien does and what I do. Damien and his studio crew did the most meticulous part with the butterflies, which are printed, not actual butterflies. He asked me if I wanted the vegan or the carnivore version. I chose vegan, but still there is a layer of paint between each printed wing that's built up to give surface dimension. And then that was shipped to my studio in Los Angeles, where I painted and added layers of paper to add my portion to it. But I think that the way the two come together is really special.
In all art, you're looking for harmony, but I think the harmony is on the edge of chaos. And I think that you often have to step over the edge to find out where it is. You know, a lot of the things I make, I like to take to the edge. You know, I like to kind of push people in that direction. I think that's something that we all have in common. Space Invader had the idea to put a Space Invader in a formaldehyde tank, and my initial thought was, I can't think of anything worse. You know, it's like you just think it's so obvious. And then I went away and I thought, I should just do it. I made a piece that we titled Secret from the Deep, and it was a giant Space Invader in a formaldehyde tank. And I used a tank that is kind of the size of like a small horse, so it's really, really big Space Invader. And I made the Space Invader using this company that make huge kind of perfume bottles for department stores. And I thought as well, you know, he's got a piece on the space station, he's sent them out into the upper atmosphere, and then so I like the idea of having it, you know, from the deep as well. So having it in liquid, which, you know, seemed really good. So I just tried it, and I think it looks amazing. It's, you know, it's kind of, I don't know. What I love about it is it's so obvious and expected, but yet when you see it, it's still really unexpected.
When Invader, Damien, and I started to talk about this project, there were really no set ways of working. We just were enthusiastic about working with each other. And I think that a natural thing that happened was that each of us were fascinated by certain iconography and aesthetics from the other. So there was an excitement to explore how to work with that imagery or that technique. This series is called Positive Space, Negative Space, and it's because there is a back and forth between the positive space and the negative space, whether you consider the Invader icon, the negative space, or the positive space, or my tile designs with my Obey icon, the negative space or the positive space. That's really up to you as the viewer. But the way that Space Invader and I have both used a grid system for our work, I often use it for pattern design, and patterns, of course, are the nature of tiles. So this was a series that Invader and I both thought would work really well immediately when the concept of this show arose. And I spent some time coming up with different patterns that I thought might work. Invader weighed in on what he liked the most, and then we configured these. Invader then had the tiles themselves produced here in the UK, having them screen printed, baked, so they're very permanent and archival tiles. He also made some extras to use on the street. These are simple, but I think very effective in the way that both of our imagery is playing an important role, and the way that there's a very nice rhythm and vibration to the repeat pattern.
So with these tile pieces with Space Invader, he sent me an idea of an image which was black and white tiles of 9 invaders and 2 invaders above each other, and said, did I want to do something to it? I remembered I'd made this scalpel painting, which was just of single scalpel blades at a slight angle. And it was called Black Rain, and it was just on a black background. And I just thought the Space Invader piece just needed something very simple and not too intrusive, but with a kind of violence to it. So I just added these scalpel blades. I was worried actually that Space might think it's not enough, but he loved it, and I think it works really, really well. It's like, because it's, the two things go together really well. The meaning, there's a kind of sense of attack throughout the whole thing. The idea seemed to have the least chance of success when I thought of it. But actually, when I tried it, I think it's one of the most successful pieces, and I love it. And I think that's the nature of collaborating, the way that you can be surprised by the end result.
I think working with Damien, who has so many different ways he's worked, and some of them are incredibly detail-oriented, things that are complex, like the butterfly mandalas or the spot paintings. For me to figure out how to work with those, it pushed me outside of what I normally do. This is the first spot painting that I worked on with Damien. The process was that he sent me an image of a spot painting that he had made, intending to potentially have me work on top of it. And I thought to myself, it looks really great as a spot painting. What can I do that brings my work to it without compromising what is so great about the spot paintings? So my first thought was, I want to make sure that it can be an image that is not so complex that it distracts from the hypnotic rhythm of the spots, and also that it has a translucency. You get the vibration of the spots, but the imagery can be seen through the spots, on top of the spots, but still allowing the spots to be maintained almost everywhere. They're slightly pushed back in contrast with spray paint. I executed my part of it with spray paint stencils, and I had to carefully mask out most of the spots that Damien had painted, and spray paint on top of that, always standing back, looking to see if the right amount of contrast, the right amount of push-pull had been achieved. But I'm very happy with the way that these things live together. And my images of an archetype of an environmental activist. She has this button with the flower on her beanie, and then there's a lyric from a Gang of Four song, 2 steps forward, 6 steps back, which is what we've been doing with environmental concerns. But I like the idea conceptually that there's always so much noise that a really important global issue seems to be something that people don't take enough time to focus on. And that's where I thought the hypnotic nature of the spots and the issue itself were interacting in a way that was conceptually logical and powerful.
You can spot a Shepard Fairey work by its colour. And those colours are, really strong. They're really powerful mix of colours. It's almost like the colours work like a kind of agenda, almost like he's picked a set of colours that represent himself. And then, so for me to have the spot paintings that have a kind of randomness and every colour and all this kind of like huge colour thing going on, to fuse those two things together becomes quite difficult. So I think a lot of trust has to be involved in that.
When Damien offered me this huge medical supply case made of stainless steel and glass as a place where I could do anything I wanted, I felt that it was important for me to find a connection between how he uses a display case like this and something that I would want to say. Damien often shows pills or medical supplies like scalpels and surgical equipment. So I thought about my illustrations of people and the ways in which female activists and icons are often dissected with a different level of scrutiny than their male counterparts. And so I suggested to Damien that I create portraits of Naomi Klein, Jane Fonda, and Malala, all of whom are people I admire, and then dissect those into bits and then have Damien add these scalpel blades.
He sent it to me in the primary colours of red, yellow, and blue. And I remember thinking of a huge Barnett Newman painting called Who's Afraid of Red, Yellow, and Blue, and thinking it's kind of got that kind of primary feel to it. So I thought what I should try and do is overlay something a bit more complicated than just flat scalpel blades. And then I thought of the mandalas, but doing the mandalas with scalpel blades. So initially I did it with them starting in the center, but it was right in the middle of Jane Fonda's nose, and it kind of made her look a bit like a clown. And so then I raised it up and put it in between her eyes, and then it looked like a kind of a Ziggy image from, you know, when Bowie used to use that kind of makeup. And also it just gave it loads more power. And then so I took the circles from there and extended them outwards, and just used different kinds of scalpels in concentric circles throughout the whole thing. And I think it's really great the way that, you know, the images are cut up, the women are cut up, yet they're formulated, and when you look very closely they contain this kind of violence which is in the scalpel blades, but the scalpel blades are kind of, you know, they entice you because it's a pattern, so it's got this kind of, you know, love, hate, beware, danger, poison, you know, attraction, repulsion thing going on. And I think, you know, not that I have the same level of activism that Shepard has, but you know, I'm aware of his activism, so I was aware that the scalpel blade is a kind of great symbolic object for, you know, what he's talking about in this work. So I think the fusion of those two things together works really well, and it's one of my favorite pieces in the show.
Now, the way that Damien configured the scalpel blades was in much more beautifully executed and innovative than what I had conceived of. So the great thing is that Damien liked the idea, but then he built upon the idea in a way that I never could have imagined. So I think that this is an excellent hybrid of the way that Damien might use this case with how I want to comment on uh, gender politics and, you know, and showcase people I admire, but also showcase them with the disturbing asterisk of they've been sliced and diced in the way their male counterparts might not be.
There was a funny little thing that I did where I kind of wanted to include some cigarette paintings where they're just basically ashtrays. I just collected loads and loads of cigarette butts and then stuck them on canvas. You know, they kind of stink and they're awful, but you know, I just love the idea of using the kind of waste in that way of a cigarette painting. And it's, you know, in a way they're quite kind of punk, you know, to kind of, you know, do that, like the safety pin, the dyed out cigarette, or the, you know, I mean, somebody once asked me why I used those cigarettes in cigarette cabinets and paintings, and I said because, you know, we often feel like a dyed out cigarette when a relationship ends or something like that. And so I kind of showed some to Space Invader and said, look, I've got these cigarette paintings, and you know, maybe I'll include them. I meant like as works of my own. And I said, unless you've got any ideas. And then he said, let me have a think. And then he came back and he said he's got all these crypto punks where they're smoking. And I thought, oh, that's kind of good. And he said, maybe we could combine the two. And then I thought about painting on top of the actual paintings, and I just thought, it'll just be a nightmare because to paint on top of like all the cigarette books and the shapes, and you won't really see the image and everything. And then I thought, oh, I know, I can just put plexi covers on the paintings and I can paint them on the plexi covers. And so we did that, and they're kind of, I just like the idea of kind of the punk of a cigarette painting and then a crypto punk on top of it, and then the, you know, the pixelated versions, you know, the pixels on top of the cigarette trash, because the kind of cigarettes look a bit like pixels as well. And so we made 4 for the show.
Sometimes taking things apart and rebuilding them can have an element of chaos, but ultimately when it's a true collaboration, there is intention and a joint vision to the end result.
Space Invader sent me an image of Joe Strummer that he'd made in tiles, and I think it was taken from an early work by Shepard, which was like a collage that he'd made of an early picture of Joe Strummer. Joe Strummer used to be a friend of mine. Space knew that, so he said, oh, I'm going to get Shepard to work on this, and maybe you want to work on one too.
Space Invader actually conceived these based on an older portrait of Joe Strummer that I did as part of a punk icon series in the early 2000s. He sent me his mosaic interpretation of my Joe Strummer portrait, which is simple enough to translate into tiles pretty successfully, but then asked me to do what I would do on top. So what I did was took my original illustration and treated it as if it had been ripped away from being over top of Space Invader's mosaic. I love the transgressive nature of punk rock and street art. When I put a poster up on the street and someone comes and rips at it, it often becomes even more interesting than it was originally. So this was the first version of this that was developed. And then Damien wanted to be part of this series as well. So he developed his version that uses the spot painting element within each of these tiles.
I was kind of looking at it, I didn't really know exactly what I could do to it. And then I realized that as the tiles are square, I could do, like in the center of every tile, a different colored dot, like on a dot painting. So I tried that, and I did it in the black squares only, and it didn't really work. I don't know why. So then I did it in the white squares as well, but not in the background. And I think that really worked. And then when we put them together with Shepard's version, where he kind of painted his own version on the top and kind of made it look a bit ripped and torn, I think the two work together really well, you know, and you know, I guess there's the difference really between Shepard and Space and I is that Shepard has a kind of organic sort of form with the rips and tears, whereas we're much more geometric with like the spots and the Space Invaders. So I think that kind of combination worked really well.
And I think that that has a completely different effect that allows Damien's aesthetic to really shine. And, you know, both are homages to Joe Strummer, but they have a different feeling. And yet I think they work as a diptych and really allow all three of us to have our moment in the aesthetic spotlight. I think it's important to approach collaboration without one single conception of it in mind. One could see it as a way of converging things about each other's work that can be harmonious, or you can see it as a clash or a blend of both, which is really the approach that I took. I think that relentless experimentation to find the right combinations of our styles, our methodology, our color palettes, our ingredients, that's what gets a result that's exciting.
So initially when we started doing the collaborations, I kind of went for spots and spin paintings and butterflies, you know, and kind of sort of what would be expected of my work to kind of mix with their work, or, you know, and then I realized they're all actually quite old works. And then I thought, well, you know, I can't really do a cherry blossom painting. And then I thought, well, why not? Why can't I do a cherry blossom painting? And then I thought, oh yeah, maybe I could. So I kind of went back to that, and then I thought, why don't I just kind of obliterate a cherry blossom painting with one of their logos? So I mocked it up, and then I masked out on canvas the shape of a Space Invader on one, you know, several Space Invaders on another, like a whole set of them moving around. There was like, you know, 20 Space Invaders, and then a huge Obey logo.
For him to ask to put my icon face on top of that, mingling with that, was a really surreal moment for me. But the way that Damien had originally conceived it was with the icon face being a solid black or dark blue. Because I'm a street artist and I use spray paint, and often if I want translucency, I just don't spray the paint opaquely. I just let a mist partially cover the surface. My immediate thought was, I think the icon face should function like that. It should be translucent. So I did a digital mock-up with the icon face translucently over the cherry blossom, and Damien said, "Oh, that took it to a much better place. I never would have thought of that because I don't use spray paint." This is one of those moments where I really think that our different perspectives ended up yielding something that neither of us would have thought of. I would have never had the audacity to ask him to basically put my icon face over one of these very time-consuming cherry blossom paintings. But I think the end result is a really compelling blend. It's both lush and subtle in many ways, but also iconic and powerful. When I can pull off a blend like that, I'm always very happy. There's the history of the exquisite corpse, where during the early 20th century, artists would send pieces to each other and even obscure their own contribution so that the other artists, what they added, they wouldn't necessarily know how it figured into the other artist's work until it was all revealed at the end. What Space Invader Damien and I did was not like that. It was very, very deliberate in terms of so many iterations back and forth, ideas thrown out, shot down, reworked, commentary via text message, via email. And we all are very decisive people, but at the same time, we'd say, okay, this isn't working, but try this, try that. And that's where maybe it would evolve to become something that was successful.
Oh, actually, there's another piece that Space and I did together where I gave him a cabinet of mine, and then he put Space Invaders inside the cabinet, but they wouldn't quite fit, and so I said, well, why don't you just stick some Space Invaders on top of the cabinet, so that the cabinet's not containing them? And he went, oh yeah, maybe. And then he actually cut Space Invaders in half for the top row, so they're coming out at the top of the cabinet. And we titled it Possibilities of Escape. But I really love the idea that, I give him an artwork and it's kind of confined, and then he collaborates with it and he escapes the confines of that. I don't know, I love that.
Space Invader and I have bonded over music. We have a lot of the same loves of music. The Clash, the Sex Pistols, the Ramones, the Misfits, but also proto-punk and glam. So you've got Lou Reed from the Velvet Underground, Iggy Pop, and David Bowie, who were kind of the triple trouble guys of the early 70s, people who influenced a lot of others. So doing this series, I knew that these were all music icons that Space Invader liked. So what I did was I ran the idea by Invader of me using his Invader icons as the pixels to compose the images. But rather than stop there, I wanted to blend our styles in a way that was really more half of each of us by going on top of the squares, the pixels, with stencils to create figuration of the features, mostly just the eyes and within the faces, and let almost all of the rest of it just become more abstract and dictated by the shapes of the pixels themselves. So there's almost solid black pixels, a mid-tone gray, and then the lighter ones with cut paper. So it's really a blend of our aesthetics and styles. I like these a lot because I do feel like there's a DNA combination here that's pretty special and pretty unexpected. It took a lot of experimentation to get these to work the way I wanted them to work. They're a combination of laser engraving, spray painting, and collage with cut paper. So it was a lot of different elements of the process, but I think that they really ended up turning out exactly, achieving exactly what I was hoping for, which is giving a really unexpected blend of our aesthetics.
So a lot of the kind of works that I think that, you know, the collaborations that we've been involved in get very close to lots of different kinds of chaos. I mean, I know that Space and Shepard are both interested in punk, you know, and I love punk. You know, I was kind of 13 in '77, but you know, punk changed my life, and it's like, it just made me kind of think there are no rules, which, you know, because it's like, you know, the whole system, especially in the UK where I grew up, you know, my parents were furious and the establishment was furious, but yet the Sex Pistols got to #1. And, you know, before the Sex Pistols, I was into the Beatles, and it was my parents' music. You know, in ways, I learned a lot more from the Beatles than I did from someone like Picasso, and then even more from the Sex Pistols.
There have been a lot of reasons for collaboration historically, some of them political. Sometimes it's to say that the cult of the individual is not what this particular movement is about. This has got more of a cooperative spirit, and I love that side of collaboration when it is political in that way. I don't think that Triple Trouble is intended as some sort of manifesto about collective partnership or a communal ethos. I think it's about friendship and mutual respect. So this piece, called Troubled Waters, is the largest piece in the exhibition. It's a three-way collaboration, and I think the way in which it materialized is it's pretty interesting, and materialized is a good word, because I originally sent these collaged papers that were done in my studio in Los Angeles with a combination of blotting, of stenciling, of collage. I sent those as individual pieces to Damien, thinking that he would use them as raw material in some way or another in something that he would conceive. Well, he got the pieces of paper, laid them out on the ground, and decided that they all looked great together and that he should make something that worked with all of them. And I think he spent some time deciding what sequence. And normally I would never do this way. This is rotated differently. But when he sent me the mock-up, I actually loved that it was the unexpected twist within the piece.
Shepard sent me 8 sheets of kind of paper that he'd painted on that. I think they're kind of like backgrounds that he works on, or things that he tears and rips and works on, and they've got printed elements, painted elements, and they're all very different. And he, you know, he said, "Do you like these?" And I said, "Yeah, I love them." And then he sent me 8, and one was red, and I remember thinking, that's a bit odd that there's a red one. And I was thinking, maybe I'll go back to him and get a different colour. But then I kind of liked the red, and I was going to do 8 different things on them, but they were kind of misshapen, so I actually mounted them on canvas. So I ordered 8 canvases and mounted them on canvas so that they were much squarer. And then I put them all out on the floor, and they all looked great together. So I stuck them all together, and there were kind of gaps between them. So I painted all the edges so that there weren't any gaps, and were kind of lots of drips and blobs, and they went in different directions. And it didn't make any kind of sense, but you know, it did and it didn't. And then I quite liked that. I was going to paint spots on top, but because it was a kind of collage paper and it was quite thick, I painted a few spots and they didn't really work, especially where they went over the gaps. So I ended up cutting spots out of a kind of card vinyl material and hand painting them, and then I glued them all over it. And it's a huge piece. It's like 5 meters by 3.5 meters. Sort of, again, on the edge of harmony and chaos, which is what we all love.
He then showed me the piece with his spots, working on top of it, and said, "But I think we definitely can incorporate some of Space Invader in this. Space Invader then added this icon of his, the Invader surfing on the wave, which is what then gave the piece its name. Damien and Invader decided that using this acrylic that had been painted sitting on top of the paper that it was mounted to panel would unify their contributions. It's a really unusual piece in that it doesn't look like exactly like anything any of us have done. Obviously, Invader has done plenty of things with this format, but never with a background like this. I don't think that Damien's ever done spots on a background like this. And I've never used these materials that I use in other ways in this way in any of my work. So it's a pretty special piece, and it came together very organically, and I'm thrilled with the result.
I mean, I think the show Triple Trouble is a really successful show, and I think it's surprised me how successful it's turned out to be.
There are some things that I think are very obvious in the way that I can work with Space Invader or the way I can work with Damien in certain things, and of course that's a great starting point, but a good collaboration shouldn't end there. I think it should really test the artist's ability to solve the problem of where that collision can become harmonious, or something that would be maybe too obviously harmonious can find a little bit of dissonance as well. Chaos and control, these are the balances that I'm striving for in my work, and I think both Invader and Damien Hirst are also. So we enjoyed the process. It wasn't always easy to find the right solution, but the process of sending things back and forth was always enjoyable, because I would get things that were unexpected that would spark a new idea.
It's like you kind of get to see all of our works, yet you get to see something else, which is the combination of all of our works. And I think, you know, there's a kind of infectious quality to the whole show, which is our mutual love of art and our kind of mutual respect for each other.
We had a very spur of the moment, spontaneous idea, or Damien did, but I knew that Invader was excited about it, I was excited about it, and then we just put in the work to make it manifest, and I'm extremely proud. I've gotten a lot of feedback from people saying this is an incredible show.
There's a kind of harmony, I think, that goes throughout the whole show in Triple Trouble, and it's like, you know, it's been as surprising for me as I hope it has for the other artists, and I hope it has for the viewers, because it's like, you know, it's like there's, you know, something kind of magical and news come out of, you know, three old guys getting together and trying to do something exciting. Older guys, maybe.